Jesus is in trouble. He's made some folks very angry and very nervous about all the many things that he's doing. Earlier in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has been going around casting out demons and healing the sick. He's been forgiving sins and eating with tax collectors. And he had been breaking the law of God by feeding and healing people on the Sabbath. He's in trouble. Folks are angry with him. They're anxious about his behavior. They're concerned that maybe he has lost his mind. Maybe he has lost his mind. His family is so concerned that they come to try to bring him home. You know, come on, son. Come on, it's time for you to stop this nonsense. Come on home with us. It'll all be okay once we get you home. That's what his mother and brothers and sisters are thinking and saying as they come to gather Jesus and take him home. The scribes are angry because Jesus is breaking all the rules. He's living in ways and teaching and being rabbi in ways that is really not the way it's supposed to be. And so they come along and say, you know, Rabbi Jesus, you're misbehaving. And it's time for you to stop what you're doing. We're so concerned that we actually think you are possessed with a demon. And it's the demon's fault that you are acting this way, that you are misbehaving like this. And so Jesus, as he often does something that we expect, and he speaks to them in a parable. He says, "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand. But his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered." Essentially here, Jesus is saying to these religious leaders, how can I be Satan when I cast out Satan? Interesting question, right? Jesus is making the point that he isn't possessed by Satan. He is Satan's enemy. In fact, he's an intruder in Satan's house. He's the one who ties up Satan and steals back all the things that Satan has taken from society and from our lives. He's plundering, destroying Satan's house by breaking the rules. He's going in to defeat Satan, where Satan has taken away our peacefulness, our ability to live peacefully in the world. Jesus reaches into Satan's house and restores that peace. Where our lives are full of worry and anxiety, Jesus reaches in and restores peacefulness and restores comfort for us. Where our lives are torn apart by anger and despair, Jesus reaches in to build reconciliation, to restore relationships. Jesus is destroying Satan's house by breaking the rules, by forgiving people's sins even though they don't deserve it, by healing the sick on the Sabbath day even though it's against the law, by having a meal with people whom others don't like even though they're hated by some. Jesus sits down at table with them and shares a meal. You see, at the time, following God meant following the rules and obeying the law. But Jesus didn't do this. So naturally, the people thought he was crazy They thought he was possessed by a devil. That was the only way they could make sense out of how this rabbi is behaving. Surely something has gotten a hold of him, and if only we can cast it out, he'll become the faithful, obedient rabbi that the scribes expected him to be. One day on his way home from work, Bob was rear-ended by another car. The damage to his bumper was pretty extensive. The other driver was a young man who'd just gotten his driver's license and started driving, and he was terrified that all of a sudden now he'd been in an accident and things were going to go very badly for him. And so Bob says to him, "It's no big deal. Don't worry about this. Just remember to slow down, to pay attention, and pay it forward one day. Be kind to someone when they least expect it." This same scenario played out in our own parking lot when a person backed into another parishioner's car. Rather than get upset and demand that the other person cover the repair, the parishioner says, "It's really no big deal. It didn't do that much damage. Don't worry about it. It's okay." You see, in 2006, tragedy struck the Amish community in Pennsylvania. You may recall the story. One day, a man entered a one-room schoolhouse and started shooting. 5 students, along with the gunman, died that day. You can imagine the horror, the outrage. But what no one expected was the way this Amish community would respond. They should have been angry. They should have called for justice. But within hours of the shooting, the community offered forgiveness to this man and his distraught family. They held his sobbing father in their arms and comforted his wife. One of the grandfathers of a student killed said, "We must not think evil of this man." A couple days later, 30 members of the Amish community attended the gunman's funeral. It's people like this community who break the rules of our society. We have laws in place for situations like this. We have expectations for how we are supposed to behave. When someone damages your vehicle, you call the police, you seek out the repair, and they are responsible for covering it. But what happens when we break the rules, when we act outside of the expectations, when we take a different path? That's what happened in this Amish community. That's what happens when we stand up to break the rules that might hold us bound to the ways of society. When I think of stories like this, it reminds me, it actually confronts me with all the times in my life when I could have responded like that but didn't. Like the times I sought to get even with someone rather than be compassionate toward them. Or the times when I thought only a certain type of person was worthy of my time and my attention. When I think about these things, suddenly it feels like Jesus is sneaking his way into my life, crawling in through a window I didn't know was left open. Suddenly Jesus is stealing from me things that I hold on to, my desire to get even with someone, my tendency to favor those who think and act like me over those who don't. And I like those things, and I don't really want to give them up. So before Jesus can take them from me, he has to first tie me up with love and remind me that that's not the person he has called me to be. As Jesus breaks into our lives through the waters of baptism, we are transformed into people who live differently in this world. We are called to live with compassion, with faithfulness, with a reaching out to others in love that might look differently than the world expects us to be. And therefore, people might actually think that we're possessed, that we've somehow gone crazy and are out of our mind to be acting in ways that are unconventional, unlike the ways society would expect. But that's the nature of who we are. That's the nature of the church. We are people transformed to live in a world that needs transforming, and God works in and through our lives to break the rules, to shake and rattle the walls, so that while we might look to be a bit crazy, it is the way that God has made us and calls us to be. Every congregation, every church has unspoken rules. Rules that aren't actually in print anywhere or that we don't actually even talk about. They're just sort of unspoken, and yet they're there below the surface. Rules like you aren't supposed to sit in someone else's seat. That's a rule often in congregations, isn't it? And so the visitor who comes in, that's the first thing they're concerned about. Where do I sit? Because, everybody has their favorite seat. And so I don't know quite where to sit. And so that feeling of anxiety. Or maybe there's an unwritten rule that you have to worship here for a certain amount of time before you can participate in some meaningful way. Or maybe there's an unwritten rule that you're really not a member until you've stood up in front of the congregation to be recognized. Or maybe there's an unwritten rule that says because you've been here a long time, you have more influence over the way things happen. Unwritten rules shape our life together, and I think that God is calling us to break these rules, to begin to think and live differently in the world. So I wonder if Jesus is intruding into this congregation, into our hearts, and asking us to live differently. What might that look like for us if we started breaking some rules? What might Jesus be inviting us to do differently? Maybe it isn't rushing to the same pew each Sunday, but it's looking around to see if there's someone who's sitting by himself or herself and going over and sitting with them. Maybe it's inviting your neighbor to attend worship with you next week, and then taking the time to pick them up that Sunday morning, drive them to church, sit with them through worship, introduce them to some of your friends. Maybe it's reaching out to a newcomer and specifically inviting them to participate in a particular way. Maybe it's sticking around a little longer after church to talk with someone you don't know very well, getting to know them, asking about their life, really listening to who they are. Maybe we break the rules by how we reach out to someone we encounter at the grocery store. A mother wrestling with a fidgety child and a grocery cart full of groceries, and maybe it's stepping aside and saying, "Why don't you go in front of me?" Maybe it's offering to push the cart so that the mom can tend to her child. Maybe it's standing up for someone who's being bullied. Maybe it's taking a stand and saying, "No, that's not the way this is going to be, for I am this person's friend, and you will not speak to them or treat them in that way." Maybe it's going downtown for a Moral Monday and standing with others who are speaking out against the lack of fair wages or the inability of some to vote. Maybe it's you fill in the blank. How is it that we can break the rules, that we can live differently in this world. Others may look at us and say, oh, they're off their rockers. You know, all those people over there at St. Philip, they're really going mad. Look at them, breaking the rules. It's not the way it's supposed to be here. But maybe, just maybe, that's what God is calling us to do. For sometimes we get too complacent. We get too comfortable. We get too settled. And then we don't even realize what the rules are anymore because they've become such a part of our life together. Maybe it's worth some conversation to think about what it is and how it is that God is calling us to be the church, to be the gospel, to reach out to others with the hope of the love of God. For my sisters and brothers, we've been set free. God has defeated the evil one, and through the power of the gospel, we are set free to live and to break the rules. We are set free to take risk, to reach out and sit with those whom others don't want to sit with, to care for those whom others might shun. We've been equipped and set free to break the rules that might hold us bound, so that we can be the gospel for the world that needs to know that through Christ and by God's grace, we are all brothers and sisters in the family of God. And together, we are drawn into the unity of that love. Let's live boldly. Let's live faithfully in the kingdom of God today, right now. As we live and breathe, may God guide and bless us always. Amen.